The summer of 64 AD began like any other, bustling markets, temples humming with prayer, the marble heart of Rome glittering beneath the Mediterranean sun. But on the night of July 18th, a flame was lit that would devour the city, and with it something far more sacred. The fire began in the merchant stalls near the Circus Maximus. Fueled by oil, wood, and dry heat, it spread like a curse. For 9 days Rome burned. Entire districts vanished. Temples, libraries, homes reduced to glowing ash. The skyline warped into a wall of smoke. Families fled with what little they could carry, only to be consumed by the fire's advance. Even stone cracked and melted under the heat. And amid the chaos, Nero watched. Some said he played his lyre from the heights of his palace, singing of Troy as flames mirrored his melody. Others claimed he ordered the fire, seeking to clear space for his golden palace, a sprawling vanity project known as the Domus Aurea. The truth? We may never know, but what came next was not a mystery. Rome needed answers. It needed a culprit. Nero, desperate to preserve his reputation and avoid revolt, pointed his imperial finger, not at arsonists, not at rival politicians, but at a small, peculiar sect of religious outcasts. They called themselves Christians, followers of a crucified prophet from Judea. They spoke of salvation, resurrection, and a kingdom not of this earth. They refused to worship the emperor. They met in shadows, buried their dead in catacombs, and shared whispers of eternal life over bread and wine. To Nero, they were perfect. The fire had ravaged the empire's capital. Now Nero would unleash another inferno, this time upon human flesh. A purge masked as justice, a slaughter justified by spectacle, and in doing so, he would make history, not for rebuilding Rome, but for orchestrating one of its most infamous atrocities. This is not just the story of a fire, it's the story of a lie that lit Christians like candles and tried to snuff out faith with flame. But instead, it sparked something no Roman sword could kill, a legend, a legacy, a martyrdom that would echo through centuries. Now we turn to the ashes and ask, when Nero set Rome ablaze, what else did he ignite? It began as a flicker. Just after midnight, near the Circus Maximus, fire kissed the dry wood of market stalls and spread with a hunger Rome had never seen. The wind turned it into a predator. Within hours, it leapt across narrow alleyways and devoured entire districts. Rome had burned before fires were common in the densely packed city, but nothing like this. Temples crumbled into molten stone, statues wept rivulets of bronze, marble columns split with the heat, families choked on smoke or were crushed beneath collapsing roofs. Rich and poor alike were reduced to refugees, watching their gods and their histories turn to cinders. And where was the emperor? Safe. Observing, perhaps composing. According to some accounts, Nero was miles away in Antium when the fire began. But he returned swiftly, and what he did then only fanned the flames of rumor. He opened his palace gardens to the homeless. He organized relief. He financed rebuilding efforts from the imperial treasury. But it wasn't enough. Because Rome wanted answers, not charity, justice, not alms. And soon whispers grew teeth. They said Nero's men had been seen blocking access to water, that they'd been caught throwing torches, that the emperor himself had dreamed of a new golden Rome and destroyed the old one to clear the land. They even said he'd watched the fire from a high tower, strumming a lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. Whether any of this is true doesn't matter. What mattered then, what matters now, is that the people believed it. And Nero, sensing the ground shifting beneath his feet, decided the fire needed a villain more than a cause. He would give them one. Not a general, not a rebel, not a senator with aspirations, but a sect, a fringe, foreign movement that refused to bow before his image. A community that worshipped in secret, that called themselves followers of the way. Their strange customs were already drawing suspicion. Their loyalty wasn't to Rome. It was to someone they claimed had risen from the dead. They were already hated. Now they would be hunted. And so, from the ashes of temples rose something darker than flame, a narrative carefully sculpted, a fiction more dangerous than any fire. The Christians had done it, Nero claimed. They had set Rome ablaze, and they would pay with their lives. In the smoky aftermath of Rome's devastation, Nero did what tyrants have always done. He gave the people a name to curse, the Christians. They were still a mystery to most Romans, small in number, strange in custom. Their rites were whispered about in taverns and forums. Rumors clung to them like shadows, that they drank blood, ate flesh, practiced incest, hated all joy and laughter, and rejected the gods that had guarded Rome for centuries. Tacitus, writing years later, captured the venom in the words used to damn them, not so much for the crime of arson as for hatred against mankind. That phrase, hatred against mankind, was the charge. A vague, total accusation, one that didn't just condemn actions, it condemned identity. To many in Rome, Christians weren't just criminals, they were a contagion. They refused to worship the emperor. They wouldn't sacrifice at the altars of Jupiter, Mars, or Venus. They rejected the state's gods and festivals, and thus, in Roman eyes, rejected the very soul of the empire. Their refusal wasn't political, it was spiritual, but that made it more dangerous. Because Rome's greatness, its victories, its very existence, was believed to be blessed by the gods. So when Christians abstained from festivals, when they refused to sprinkle incense before a statue of Caesar, when they baptized in underground catacombs and shared meals they called the body and blood, the public didn't see piety. They saw treason, and Nero, ever the performer, turned their image into a monster. He didn't need evidence. He needed theater. Accusations turned into convictions, convictions into death sentences. The Christians, men, women, even children, were rounded up. Some were new converts. Some had been born into the faith. Many had never set foot outside their own neighborhoods. But now they were enemies of the empire. Their names written on lists, their fates sealed with wax and blood. They weren't tried, they were displayed. And what followed wasn't justice, it was spectacle. Because for Nero, punishment was not enough. It had to be exquisite, as Tacitus described it, memorable, visceral, something to distract the masses from their hunger and anger. The scapegoats had been chosen. Now came the slaughter. Nero understood one thing better than any Roman emperor before him. Death could be entertainment. And if the citizens of Rome demanded blood, he would give it to them not in the arena but in his very own gardens. Execution became performance. Suffering became spectacle. The Christians, now branded as arsonists and traitors, were sentenced not to die but to die memorably. Some were sewn into the skins of wild beasts, their limbs bound, their identities erased. Then, before jeering crowds, they were thrown to hungry dogs, torn apart in orchestrated savagery. Their deaths were not swift, they were designed to last, to echo, to feed the rumor that Christians were less than human. Others were crucified, lined up along Rome's roads and palace walls in grotesque rows, their bodies sagging on wooden crosses in mockery of their crucified god. But the most horrific innovation, Nero's true artistic flourish, was the use of fire. At night, when the lamps were lit and guests arrived for feasts in the imperial gardens, Christians were transformed into torches. First, they were stripped and bound to stakes. Then their bodies were coated in pitch and oil. They were gagged to preserve silence, or worse, left to scream. And as the sun set, they were set alight. These were not symbolic executions. They were human candles. The flames danced across their flesh, the fat feeding the fire, the bones glowing beneath scorched skin. Smoke twisted up into the Roman sky as dinner guests toasted to the emperor's mercy. Musicians played, servants poured wine. Nero, ever the actor, sometimes dressed in theatrical robes, and rode through the infernal garden in a chariot, marveling at the illumination his scapegoats provided. To him, it was art. To the crowd, it was justice. To the victims, It was agony incarnate. And yet in that pit of cruelty, something remarkable happened. Some of the Christians did not cry out. Some looked heavenward as their skin melted from their bones. Some sang. Their silence unnerved the crowd more than screams ever could. Their composure made mockery of the emperor's cruelty. What was meant to destroy their faith seemed to prove it. The Roman world had seen executions, but it had never seen this. And in that theater of torture, beneath the flickering shadows of dying martyrs, a strange realization began to flicker too, that perhaps these victims were not enemies. Perhaps they were something else entirely. Something began to shift, not in the flames, but in the hearts of those who watched. Because the executions weren't working, not in the way Nero intended. He had designed them as warnings, as deterrents, as flaming signposts of what would happen to those who defied the empire. But the Christian victims did not behave like criminals. They did not beg. They did not curse the emperor. They did not renounce their faith. They endured. Some died praying. Others died singing hymns. Their mouths moved in whispered psalms, even as fire peeled their skin from muscle, even as the iron tore into their joints. And for the Romans who watched, some out of duty, others out of curiosity, what began as horror turned slowly, disturbingly, into something else. Admiration, confusion, even awe. Because these weren't warriors or rebels, these were slaves, merchants, women, old men, powerless by every measure, and yet when tied to the stake, they stood stronger than the soldiers who held the torches. Their deaths became testimonies. Word spread, not in secret catacombs, but across forums and taverns, that there was a people who feared death so little, they greeted it like an old friend, that there was a belief so deep, so unshakable, it could not be burned out of the body, and Rome listened. Tacitus, no Christian himself, acknowledged the effect. A vast multitude was convicted, and mockery was added to their deaths. But then he wrote something else, something remarkable, that despite their punishment, a feeling of compassion arose, for it was felt they were being destroyed, not for the public good, but to satisfy the cruelty of one man. In short, Rome began to see the flame that was meant to incinerate Christianity had done something far more dangerous. It had illuminated it. Tertullian, a Christian writer in the following century, would put it simply: the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And that seed had now been planted deep in Roman soil, watered with pain, fertilized by fire. Faith had been turned into a public execution, but execution had become testimony. And the empire, unwittingly, had created not just martyrs, but missionaries. The fire had long since died. The Christians had burned. The crowds had cheered. The gardens had dimmed. But Nero's appetite for death did not end when the flames did. Because the problem was never just the Christians. The real problem was Nero himself. The emperor who once charmed Rome with poetry and performance was now unraveling before the eyes of his empire. The artist king had become a butcher in silk robes. He had already murdered his own mother, Agrippina, with cold theatricality, luring her to a boat rigged to collapse beneath her. When she survived, he had her stabbed. He then killed his pregnant wife, Poppaea, by kicking her in a fit of rage. And when guilt flickered, he simply married her younger look-alike. His public works bled the treasury dry. He demanded adoration, not just as emperor, but as a divine performer, forcing senators and soldiers to applaud his every poem, his every song. His concerts were mandatory, his ego insatiable. Those who fell asleep during his recitals were beaten. Some slit their own throats just to escape the endless applause. And still Nero's paranoia grew. He saw betrayal in every glance, conspiracy in every silence. Friends, tutors, generals, one by one, they were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. No evidence was necessary, just a suspicion, a rumor, a whispered name. Rome no longer feared its enemies, it feared its emperor. Even the spectacle of Christian executions, once a distraction, began to sour in the public eye. What had once been seen as justice now looked more like indulgence, cruelty for cruelty's sake. In private, the elite whispered that Nero had gone mad. In public, they bowed deeper than ever, careful not to draw his gaze. But it wasn't enough. The Senate finally acted in 68 AD. The same body that once hailed Nero as a golden youth now declared him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard, his personal protectors, turned on him. Abandoned, hunted, powerless, Nero fled to a villa outside Rome, and there, as soldiers approached, the man who had watched so many die by fire, by fang, by iron, could not face his own death. He begged for someone to kill him. No one would. So with trembling hands, Nero drove a dagger into his throat, just barely. A servant finished the job. His last words, "What an artist dies in me." But Rome didn't mourn. The city that had once burned under his gaze now sighed with relief. The mad emperor was dead, but the scars remained burned into stone, into memory, into faith. And the people he tried to erase, they were still here. The fires Nero lit in his garden died out. The charred corpses were buried or forgotten. The screams faded from Rome's palaces and streets. But something strange happened. The faith he tried to extinguish did not die. In fact, it grew. Rome had meant the executions as erasure, but martyrdom had done the opposite. It had made the Christians unforgettable. Survivors whispered the names of the burned like prayers. Stories spread of those who had walked into death without flinching, of women who sang as flames consumed them, of old men who forgave their killers with their final breath. These weren't just memories, they became scripture testimony, fuel. Each execution had been meant as a spectacle. Instead, each one had become a sermon. And in a cruel twist of fate, the very city that burned them would one day kneel before their faith. Within 3 centuries, barely the span of 3 human lives, the Roman Empire that fed Christians to beasts and fire would declare Christianity its official religion. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians. By the end of the century, the cross, once a symbol of execution, had become the symbol of power. Rome now bowed to the very man it once crucified. And the martyrs of Nero's persecution, they became saints, their names carved into stone, their stories passed from tongue to tongue across continents. Basilicas would be built atop their supposed burial grounds, and generations later, pilgrims would walk through the same gardens where Nero once dined by human light, not in horror, but in reverence. The empire that burned them became the soil from which their church grew. This is the final brutal irony of Nero's cruelty. He had tried to burn Christianity out of existence. Instead, he lit the first torch of martyrdom, and in doing so, he helped forge a faith that no flame could ever kill. The story of Nero and the burning of the Christians is more than a footnote in Roman cruelty. It's a lesson written in blood and smoke. What was meant to terrify became sacred. What was meant to erase became legend. In July of 64 AD, Rome burned, and in the panic that followed, Nero set fire to something else. Truth, decency, mercy. He turned religion into fuel, faith into performance, death into policy. He believed he could cauterize dissent with flame, but he misunderstood something vital. You can burn a body. You cannot burn belief. Those tortured in his gardens did not die in vain. They became the foundation stones of something greater than Rome's marble temples. A church built not of columns and domes, but of memory, conviction, and sacrifice. Nero is long dead. His palaces lie in ruin. His name is spoken with disgust, his legacy rotted by madness. But the movement he tried to crush endures. The faith of the people he made torches of outlived his empire. And today, in cathedrals across the world, candles are lit not by imperial decree, but in memory of those who once were the candles. So now we ask you, was Nero's persecution the moment Christianity was nearly destroyed, or the moment it truly began? Tell us what you think in the comments. Did Rome create martyrs, or saints. And if history has one message to leave us with, it is this: from ashes sometimes rises a church.